They laughed at the poor veteran for hauling an old battered dresser across Montana. To everyone else, it was dead weight, scarred wood, tarnished brass, and one more burden a struggling man could not afford. Then his German shepherd scratched at a drawer no one had ever questioned and uncovered a secret tied to a $250 million fortune. Ethan Walker had returned from war with almost nothing. No steady job, no family nearby, and nights filled with memories he wished he could forget. The one thing he refused to abandon was the old wooden dresser from his grandfather's house. People in the Bitterroot Valley mocked him for keeping it, but one quiet winter night, his loyal German shepherd, Atlas, began clawing at a drawer no one had ever questioned. What they discovered inside would change Ethan's life forever. Before we begin, tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching this story from today? I always love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. The Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana were the kind of place where winter arrived without asking permission. Snow gathered quietly along the dark slopes, clinging to pine branches and old fences, turning the world into something silent and heavy. The wind moved through the valleys like a low whisper, carrying the smell of frozen earth and distant wood smoke. On the far edge of a dirt road outside the small town of Darby stood a narrow wooden cabin that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. One window was cracked. The porch leaned just enough to make visitors nervous, but the cabin was still standing, and inside it lived Ethan Walker. Ethan had once been the kind of man people noticed when he entered a room. Tall, broad-shouldered, disciplined. The army had shaped him that way during the years he served overseas in Afghanistan. Back then, his posture had been straight, his eyes sharp, his voice calm and steady, even under pressure. Now, he carried himself differently. The weight on his shoulders was invisible, but it was always there. Sometimes it felt heavier than the mountains outside his window. He slept poorly most nights. The silence of the mountains was supposed to be peaceful, but to Ethan, it was unpredictable. The smallest noise could snap him awake. The creak of wood, the distant howl of coyotes, the wind rattling loose siding, and when he woke, he didn't wake slowly. His heart would already be racing, his muscles tight, his breath shallow. It took several seconds each time to remember that he was no longer in a desert village halfway around the world. He was in Montana. He was safe. At least, that was what he told himself. Across the room, lying on an old rug beside the wood stove, a large German shepherd lifted his head the moment Ethan stirred. The dog's name was Atlas. Atlas didn't bark. He simply watched. Dark brown eyes steady and alert, ears slightly forward. After a moment, he rose to his feet and padded quietly across the cabin floor. His nails clicked softly on the wood before he stopped beside Ethan's chair and rested his head gently against the man's knee. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he murmured, running a hand through the dog's thick fur. "I'm up." Atlas had been with him through everything. Through dust storms and mortar fire. Through long patrols and nights that seemed like they would never end. The army had assigned Atlas to Ethan during his final deployment. Officially, Atlas had been trained to detect explosives. Unofficially, he had become Ethan's shadow. The dog had saved his life once, maybe twice. After the war, when Ethan returned home, the army retired Atlas as well. Neither of them had anywhere else to go. So, they came to Montana together. The cabin wasn't much. One room, a small kitchen, a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. But it was cheap, and it sat far enough away from town that Ethan didn't have to answer questions about why loud noises made him flinch or why crowds made his hands shake. Most people in town knew him only as the quiet veteran who fixed farm equipment when someone's tractor stopped working. Sometimes, he found jobs repairing fences or clearing fallen trees. Sometimes, There wasn't any work at all. Money came and went like the mountain weather. But there was one object inside the cabin that Ethan had never considered leaving behind. It stood against the far wall, opposite the window. A dresser. Old, dark, carved from heavy wood that had long since lost its shine. The brass handles were tarnished, and the edges of the drawers were worn smooth from decades of use. Anyone looking at it would assume it belonged in a junkyard or maybe the back corner of a thrift store. But Ethan had carried that dresser with him everywhere. 3 states, 5 different apartments, 2 storage units, and finally, this cabin. He had hauled it across icy roads in the back of a borrowed pickup truck when he moved to Montana. It had been the first thing he brought inside. Atlas walked over to it now and settled down beside it, like a guard. Ethan watched him for a moment. "You like that thing more than I do," he said quietly. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls again. Ethan rose slowly from his chair and crossed the room. He placed a hand on the dresser's surface. The wood was cool beneath his fingers. There were scratches across the top, old marks from years before he owned it. Sometimes, he wondered how many people had touched this dresser before him, how many homes it had seen, how many lives had passed around it. Most people who visited the cabin noticed it right away, not because it was beautiful, but because it looked so out of place. A month earlier, a man named Rick Harlow had stood in this very room and laughed when he saw it. Rick owned one of the largest cattle ranches in the valley. He had money, land, and the kind of confidence that came from never worrying about either. Rick had been there to ask Ethan to repair a broken hydraulic line on a tractor. But when he saw the dresser, he stopped in the doorway and shook his head. "You haul that thing everywhere?" Rick asked. Ethan didn't answer. Rick walked over and tapped the wood with his knuckles. "Man," he said, chuckling, "this thing's older than the mountains." Ethan simply wiped a bit of dust from the surface. Rick leaned closer, studying the carved patterns along the edges. "You know what I'd do with this?" he said. Ethan looked up. "Firewood." Rick laughed again. "Seriously. You could chop this thing up and heat the cabin for half the winter." Atlas had stood up then, not growling, not aggressive, just watching Rick carefully. Rick noticed. "Dog likes it, huh?" Ethan finally spoke. "It stays." Rick raised both hands. "Hey, not my house." He turned toward the door. "But if you ever get tired of it," he called over his shoulder, "I'll bring an axe." The memory lingered now, as Ethan stood in the quiet cabin. Atlas shifted slightly beside the dresser. Outside, snow had begun to fall again. Soft flakes drifted past the window like slow-moving ash. Ethan rubbed his eyes. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours the night before. The nightmares had been worse lately. Louder, more vivid. Sometimes he could still hear the explosion. Sometimes he could still smell the burning metal. And sometimes, when he woke up suddenly in the dark, he had to reach down and touch Atlas just to remember he was home. The dog was real. The mountains were real, and the war was over. Ethan turned away from the dresser and added another log to the stove. The fire flared softly. Atlas stood and moved closer to the warmth. For a moment, the cabin felt almost peaceful. But outside, the wind kept blowing across the frozen valley, and somewhere beyond the mountains, the past was still catching up. Ethan didn't know it yet. But the old dresser standing against the wall, the one everyone in town thought was worthless, was about to change everything. And the first one to understand that would be the dog. Atlas lifted his head slowly from the floor beside the dresser. Outside, the Montana wind pressed harder against the cabin walls, rattling the loose boards along the porch. Snow drifted against the windows in soft white streaks, but inside the cabin, the air had grown warm from the fire Ethan had just fed. The dog didn't move at first. He simply watched the dresser. His ears tilted forward slightly, the way they always did, when something caught his attention on patrol long ago. Ethan noticed. He leaned back in the worn chair near the stove and studied Atlas across the room. "What is it, boy?" Atlas didn't answer with a bark. He rarely did. Instead, the big German shepherd stood slowly and walked to the dresser, his nose lowered to the wood, sniffing along the bottom edge, where the floor met the legs. Ethan watched the dog with mild curiosity. Mouse again? That happens sometimes during winter. Small field mice would sneak into the cabin looking for warmth. Atlas usually handled that problem quickly. But this time, the dog's behavior was different. He sniffed carefully along one side of the dresser, then the other, moving his nose across the drawers, as if reading something written into the grain of the wood. Then he sat down beside it, still staring. Ethan chuckled softly. "You guarding it now?" Atlas didn't look away. The fire cracked quietly in the stove. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. The exhaustion from another restless night weighed on him like wet snow. His eyes drifted toward the dresser. He had looked at that piece of furniture thousands of times. And yet, tonight, something about it felt heavier. Not physically, just present. It stood taller than Ethan's waist, carved from thick walnut wood darkened by age. The corners were decorated with old floral patterns that had probably been beautiful once, though now the details had softened with time. 3 of the drawers opened easily. The 4th stuck slightly if you pulled it the wrong way. Ethan knew every inch of it, or at least he thought he did. The dresser had belonged to his grandfather, Henry Walker. Henry had fought in Europe during the final years of World War II. He rarely talked about it. The few stories Ethan remembered were always told quietly, usually late at night, on the porch of the old farmhouse where Ethan grew up. Henry Walker had been the kind of man who believed words should be used sparingly. But when he did speak, people listened. Ethan remembered the day the dresser became his. It had been late autumn then, too. The leaves had already fallen from the cottonwoods around the farm, leaving the land open and quiet. Henry had called Ethan into the house. The old man had been sitting in a wooden chair beside the dresser, one hand resting on its surface. "Come here," he'd said. Ethan had stepped closer. "Take this with you when you leave." Ethan had frowned slightly. "The dresser?" Henry nodded. "Ha! Ah! E! Ah! Ah! Gay! A! Ah! 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 Gay! Ah! 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 It's been in the family longer than you think." Ethan ran his fingers across the wood, just like he had done tonight. "It's kind of old, Grandpa." Henry's mouth curved into a faint smile. "Old doesn't mean useless." Then the old man leaned back in the chair and looked directly at him. "There are things in this world people overlook because they're in too much of a hurry to see value." Ethan hadn't understood. He was 22 then, young, impatient, already preparing to enlist in the army. "Just furniture?" Ethan had said, with a shrug. Henry shook his head. "Maybe." Then he added something Ethan would never forget. Or maybe not. Back in the cabin, the memory faded like breath on cold air. Atlas shifted beside the dresser again, drawing Ethan's attention. The dog had lowered his head and was sniffing the bottom drawer more intensely now. "Still at it, huh?" Ethan rose from his chair and walked across the room. The wooden floor creaked softly under his boots. Atlas moved slightly aside, but kept watching the drawer as Ethan reached for the handle. The brass knob was cold against his fingers. He pulled. The drawer slid open easily. Inside were only a few folded shirts and an old wool blanket. Nothing unusual. Ethan pushed it closed again. "See?" he said to the dog. Atlas tilted his head. Ethan laughed quietly. "You're losing your touch, soldier." Atlas gave a soft huff through his nose and lay back down. Ethan turned toward the window. Snow had thickened outside, the flakes moving sideways in the wind. The dirt road leading toward town had already begun to disappear beneath white drifts. Tomorrow's trip into Derby would be slow, but he needed the work. Rick Harlow had called earlier that afternoon, asking if Ethan could repair a hydraulic line on one of the ranch tractors. Ethan didn't particularly enjoy working for Rick. The man had a way of talking that made everything sound like a favor he was granting the world. Still, work was work, and Ethan needed the money. His rent was already 2 weeks late. The landlord hadn't said anything yet, but Ethan knew how these things usually went. First, a warning. Then, a deadline. Then, a padlock on the door. Atlas stood again suddenly. This time, he walked back to the dresser and placed one paw lightly against the wood. Ethan turned. What now? The dog scratched once. Not aggressively, just a single careful motion. Then he sniffed the same spot again. Ethan sighed. All right. All right. He stepped over and pulled open the drawer once more. Atlas immediately leaned forward, nose dipping toward the inside. But after several seconds, the dog sat back again. Ethan looked down. Nothing. No mice. No hidden food. Just the same folded shirts. False alarm, Ethan muttered. He closed the drawer again. Atlas remained beside the dresser, watching it with quiet focus. Ethan shook his head with a tired smile. You're getting weird. In your old age. The wind howled outside the cabin again. Inside, the fire settled lower in the stove. Ethan walked back to his chair and lowered himself slowly into it. Atlas eventually returned to the rug beside the fire. But, even as he lay down, his eyes kept drifting back toward the dresser, as if he knew something no one else did. Ethan didn't notice. Not yet, but before long, the dresser everyone in town called worthless would demand attention, and Atlas would be the reason. Morning came slowly in the Bitterroot Valley. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving the mountains wrapped in a deep, white silence. Snow rested heavy on the pine branches outside the cabin, bending them toward the ground like bowed heads. Inside, the fire in the stove had died down to a faint red glow. Ethan Walker woke the way he often did, suddenly, with a sharp intake of breath that came from a dream he couldn't quite remember. For a few seconds, he didn't move. His eyes stared at the wooden ceiling. His heart thumped hard in his chest. Then the familiar warmth pressed against his side. Atlas. The German shepherd was already awake, lying beside the bed with his head resting on Ethan's boot. The dog's eyes were calm, steady, watching him the way he always did after a rough night. Ethan exhaled slowly. Morning, partner. Atlas's tail thumped once against the floor. The cabin felt colder than usual. Ethan swung his legs out of bed and pulled on a thick flannel shirt. When he opened the stove door and added fresh logs, the fire crackled back to life. Outside, sunlight began to creep across the snow-covered hills. Montana mornings had a way of making the world look brand new, even when life inside that world felt worn down. Ethan poured water into a dented metal kettle and set it on the stove. Atlas moved toward the door, waiting patiently. Yeah, Ethan said, reaching for his boots. I'm coming. The cold hit them both. The moment the cabin door opened, Atlas bounded out first, paws crunching through fresh snow as he trotted toward the tree line. Ethan stepped onto the porch and stretched his stiff shoulders. The valley below looked peaceful. Smoke curled from chimneys in the distant town of Derby. A hawk circled above the frozen fields. From a distance, it looked like the kind of place where nothing bad had ever happened. But Ethan knew better. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the tightness there. Atlas returned a few minutes later, trotting back with his usual alert posture. He shook the snow from his coat and walked inside. Ethan followed. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them again. Atlas moved straight across the room, not to the fire, not to his food bowl, but to the dresser. He sat beside it, watching. Ethan noticed this time. "You're still on that thing?" Atlas's ears twitched slightly. Ethan walked over and placed a mug of coffee on the table beside the dresser. The wood creaked softly as he leaned against it. He studied the old piece of furniture again. Maybe it was just the morning light, but the carved patterns along the edges seemed clearer today. Vines and small flowers ran along the corners, the kind of detailed craftsmanship that people didn't bother with anymore. He ran his fingers across the surface. The wood was worn smooth. "Grandpa always liked sturdy things," he muttered. That thought lingered. Henry Walker, Ethan's grandfather, had lived nearly 80 years on the same stretch of land outside Missoula. The farmhouse had been simple but strong, built with thick beams and wide windows that faced the mountains. When Ethan was a kid, he spent most summers there, fishing, fixing fences, listening to stories that Henry never told quite the same way twice. Henry had fought in Europe during the war, but the stories he shared weren't about battles. They were about the long marches through forests, about the men who stood beside you when things went wrong, about loyalty and patience. "War teaches you something most people never learn," Henry once told him. "What's that?" Ethan had asked. "That the things worth trusting aren't always the loudest or the newest." Henry had tapped the old dresser beside him. "Sometimes the strongest things are the ones that just keep standing there." At the time, Ethan thought his grandfather was just talking about furniture. Now, standing in the quiet cabin years later, he wasn't so sure. Atlas shifted again. The dog stood and pressed his nose against the side of the dresser. Then he sniffed along the bottom drawer once more. Ethan frowned slightly. "All right," he said, crouching down beside him. "Let's see what's got you so interested." He pulled open the top drawer. Nothing unusual. A few socks, an old flashlight, a folded map of the Bitterroot Valley. The second drawer held spare tools and a small hunting knife. The third drawer contained folded clothes. Atlas sniffed them briefly before pulling away. Then he sat down again, right in front of the bottom drawer. Ethan watched him for a moment. "You've checked that 3 times already." Atlas lifted one paw and tapped the drawer lightly. "Once." Ethan sighed. "Persistent, huh?" He grabbed the handle and pulled. The drawer slid out halfway, then stopped. Ethan frowned. That's new. The drawer had always stuck a little when pulled too fast. But this time, it felt different. Like something inside was catching. Atlas leaned forward again, nose nearly touching the wood. Ethan pushed the drawer back in and tried again. This time it slid out further, still nothing unusual. Just the same old wool blanket folded neatly in the bottom. Ethan lifted it out. Atlas sniffed the empty drawer. Then he looked up at Ethan with those steady brown eyes. Ethan chuckled. "If you're expecting treasure, you're about 80 years too late." He placed the blanket back inside and pushed the drawer closed. Atlas stayed where he was, watching. Ethan stood and stretched his back. The morning sunlight had reached the window now, casting long golden lines across the floor. For a moment, the cabin looked almost peaceful. Ethan grabbed his jacket. "Come on," he said to the dog. "We've got work to do." Rick Harlow's ranch was nearly 10 miles outside town, and Ethan wanted to get there before the roads iced over again. Atlas followed him to the door. But just before they stepped outside, the dog turned once more toward the dresser. He stared at it quietly, as if committing something to memory. Then he followed Ethan into the cold morning. Neither of them knew it yet, But Henry Walker's old dresser was still keeping it secret. And Atlas was the only one paying close enough attention. The Bitterroot Valley changed fast once winter truly arrived. By the time Ethan Walker reached the main road that morning, the sky had turned the color of dull steel. The sun was gone, behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the wind rolling down from the mountains carried the sharp promise of another storm. Atlas rode quietly in the passenger seat of Ethan's old pickup. The truck was nearly as worn as the cabin. Rust crept along the edges of the doors, and the heater only worked when the engine felt like cooperating. But it still ran, and right now, that was enough. Ethan gripped the steering wheel and guided the truck slowly along the narrow road that wound through the valley. Snow crunched under the tires. The radio didn't work anymore, so the only sound inside the cab was the low rumble of the engine and Atlas's steady breathing. They had driven this road hundreds of times. Atlas sat upright, watching the forest pass by the window. Every once in a while, his ears twitched. Always alert, always listening. It was the same posture he had carried during their patrols overseas. Ethan glanced at him. "Still, think you're on duty, huh?" Atlas blinked slowly, but didn't move. The ranch came into view about 20 minutes later. Rick Harlow's place was hard to miss. It stretched across nearly 200 acres of land, at the base of a wide hill. The barn was freshly painted red, and the main house stood large and modern, compared to the older structures scattered around it. Money showed everywhere. New trucks, clean fences, bright floodlights. Ethan parked near the equipment shed. The moment he stepped out of the truck, the cold wind cut through his jacket. Rick Harlow was already standing near the open barn doors. He was a tall man with a thick gray mustache and the confident posture of someone who had spent his entire life being the most powerful person in the room. When he saw Ethan, Rick smirked. "Well, look who decided to show up." Ethan shut the truck door and walked over without answering. Atlas followed close behind him. Rick noticed the dog immediately. "Still dragging that mud around with you?" Atlas stopped walking. His ears lifted slightly. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's neck. "He's not bothering anyone." "Who?" Rick chuckled. "Sure looks like he's the one doing the garden these days." Ethan ignored the comment. "What needs fixing?" Rick pointed toward the tractor parked inside the barn. Hydraulic line froze again. Ethan stepped past him and climbed up onto the machine. His hands moved automatically. Wrench, valve, check the line. The work was simple. He had fixed this tractor 3 times already this winter. Atlas settled down beside the barn door while Ethan worked. Rick leaned against a stack of hay bales, watching. "You hear the news?" Rick asked after a few minutes. Ethan didn't look up. "No, cabin rent's overdue again." The wrench in Ethan's hand paused for a second. Rick noticed. "You know the owner's not the patient type." Ethan tightened the bolt slowly. "I'm aware." Rick shrugged. "Just saying. Winter's not the best time to be looking for a new place." Ethan climbed down from the tractor. "It'll run now." Rick walked over and started the engine. The machine roared to life without hesitation. "Well," Rick said, climbing down again. "Looks like you're still worth the trouble." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. "Your pay." Ethan took it. He didn't open it yet. Rick nodded toward the truck outside. "That old thing still holding together?" "Barely." Rick's eyes narrowed slightly. "You ever think about selling that antique dresser you keep hauling around?" Ethan froze for a fraction of a second. Then he slid the envelope into his jacket pocket. "It's not for sale." Rick laughed loudly. "That thing's got to weigh 200 pounds. So you're hauling junk across Montana for sentimental reasons." He stepped closer. "Tell you what, Walker." Rick rubbed his hands together as if warming them near a fire. "I'll buy it. I'll buy it." Ethan looked up. Rick smiled wider. Not because it's worth anything. He gestured toward the mountains. But winter's coming hard this year. Rick leaned in slightly. That wood would burn real nice. And Atlas stood up immediately. His body went still. Rick glanced at the dog. See? Even he knows that thing's useless. Ethan stepped between them. Not interested. Rick shrugged again. Suit yourself. He turned toward the house. But if you change your mind, Rick called back over his shoulder, I'll give you $100 for it. Ethan walked back to the truck without answering. Atlas jumped into the passenger seat. For a moment, Ethan just stood there beside the open door. The wind howled across the field. $100. He hadn't even opened the envelope yet, but he could already guess what was inside. Probably enough to cover groceries. Not enough to cover rent. He climbed into the truck and shut the door. The envelope opened with a soft tear. Inside were 3 folded bills. $60. Ethan stared at them for a long time. Atlas watched him quietly. Outside the sky had grown darker. Snow began to fall again. Slow at first, then heavier. Ethan rubbed his forehead. 3 days, he muttered. The cabin owner's warning echoed in his mind. 3 days to pay the rent, or the place would be empty. He leaned back in the seat. Atlas rested his head gently on Ethan's arm. The warmth of the dog's breath spread through the sleeve of his jacket. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. The thought came quietly. Simple, practical, sell the dresser. $100 wouldn't fix everything, but it might buy time. He opened his eyes again. Atlas was watching him. Those steady brown eyes. The same eyes that had looked at him across a dusty road in Afghanistan when the explosion went off. The same eyes that had dragged him out of the smoke afterward. Ethan exhaled slowly. Just thinking, he whispered. Atlas didn't move. Outside, the snow kept falling. Back at the cabin, the old dresser stood silently in the corner, waiting, and somewhere deep inside its worn wooden frame, something old was beginning to shift. Night came quickly in the Bitterroot Mountains. By the time Ethan Walker's truck reached the narrow road that led back to his cabin, the sky had turned almost black. Snow drifted across the headlights in swirling patterns, thick enough that the trees at the edge of the forest looked like shadowy figures, standing guard. The truck's engine groaned as Ethan pulled into the clearing beside the cabin. He shut the engine off and sat there for a moment. The silence was immediate. No traffic. No town lights. Just the sound of wind moving through the tall pine trees. Atlas shifted in the passenger seat and looked toward the cabin. A faint glow leaked from the small window where the stove inside still held a little warmth from the morning. Ethan rubbed his tired eyes. Home, he said quietly. Atlas hopped down from the truck first, landing in the snow with a soft crunch. Ethan grabbed the grocery bag from the passenger floor, just bread, canned soup, and a small pack of coffee, and followed the dog toward the door. The cold hit harder now. Montana nights had a way of cutting straight through a man's bones. Inside the cabin, Ethan kicked the door shut and stirred the fire back to life. Flames rose slowly, throwing warm orange light across the wooden walls. Atlas shook the snow from his coat. Then he stopped. His body turned slowly toward the dresser. The old wooden piece stood in its usual corner near the window. Silent. Still. Exactly the same as it had been that morning. But Atlas was already walking toward it. Ethan noticed right away. You? Again? Atlas lowered his head and sniffed along the edge of the dresser. The dog moved carefully, nose sliding along the wood grain. One drawer, then another, then the bottom one. Ethan hung his coat on the wall and began heating soup on the stove. "Whatever you think is in there," he said casually. "I promise it's just old socks." Atlas didn't respond. Instead, he pawed lightly at the third drawer from the top. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan glanced over. "You're serious about this, huh?" Atlas pawed again. This time harder. The wood made a dull thud. Ethan sighed and walked over. "All right, let's see what the emergency is." He pulled the drawer open. Inside were folded shirts and an old wool scarf. Atlas sniffed them quickly. Then he pushed his nose deeper into the drawer. He inhaled again. Then he pulled back suddenly and scratched at the bottom of the drawer. Hard. Ethan frowned. "Hey!" He grabbed Atlas by the collar. "Easy." But the dog pulled forward again. Scratch. 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 The sound echoed through the quiet cabin. Ethan watched him carefully now. Atlas wasn't acting playful. He wasn't hunting mice either. This was the same focus he had shown overseas. The same behavior he used when detecting explosives. Ethan felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. "Atlas?" The dog paused. His ears lifted slightly. Ethan crouched beside the drawer. "What are you smelling?" Atlas lowered his head again and pressed his nose firmly against the wooden base of the drawer. Then he scratched again, harder. One claw slipped against the wood. Ethan noticed something then. The sound. The scratching didn't sound the same across the entire surface. Near the back corner, the wood gave off a faint, hollow echo. Ethan leaned closer. "That's odd." He removed the clothes completely and set them aside. Now the drawer was empty. Atlas immediately pushed his nose back inside. He sniffed again, then scratched the exact same spot. Ethan tapped the bottom panel with his knuckle. Knock. 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 Most of the drawer sounded solid, but one section near the back corner made a different noise. Hollow. Ethan sat back slightly. That shouldn't be hollow. He reached inside and pressed down on the wooden panel. Nothing happened. Atlas scratched again. Harder this time. His claws scraped the wood until Ethan grabbed his paw. "Easy, boy." Atlas whined softly. Ethan had heard that sound before, usually right before Atlas discovered something important or dangerous. He stared at the drawer again. His grandfather's words drifted back into his memory. Some things look worthless until the right person looks closer. Ethan ran his hand slowly across the bottom panel. The wood felt smooth, but near the back corner, there was the smallest ridge, almost invisible. He pressed his thumb against it. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. Atlas nudged his arm impatiently. "All right," Ethan murmured. He pushed harder this time. For a second, nothing happened. Then, click. The sound was quiet, barely louder than the snapping of a twig. But inside the drawer, something shifted. Atlas froze. Ethan slowly lifted his hand. The wooden panel moved slightly upward, just enough to reveal a thin line along the edge. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. "Well, I'll be." He slid his fingers into the gap and lifted. The entire bottom panel rose smoothly. Underneath it was a hidden compartment. Atlas leaned forward immediately. Inside the secret space sat a small leather pouch. Dark brown. Old. The kind of leather that had aged for decades. Next to it lay a folded envelope, sealed with brittle yellow tape. Ethan stared at them. For a long moment, he didn't move. The fire crackled softly behind him. Snow tapped gently against the window. Atlas sat beside him, watching. Ethan finally reached down and lifted the pouch. It felt heavier than he expected. Inside, something solid shifted. Metal, maybe, or paper bundles. He set it on the table, then picked up the envelope. On the front, written in faded ink, were 3 words. To Ethan Walker. His grandfather's handwriting. Ethan's throat tightened. Atlas rested his head quietly against Ethan's knee. For years, that old dresser had stood in the corner like nothing more than a piece of forgotten furniture. Now, suddenly, it felt like something else entirely. Like a door that had just been opened, and whatever waited behind it had been hidden there for a very long time. The cabin grew very quiet. Ethan Walker sat at the small wooden table, the leather pouch and the yellowed envelope lying in front of him. The only sound came from the slow crackle of the fire inside the iron stove and the soft wind pushing against the cabin walls. Atlas sat beside him. The German shepherd's posture was alert, but calm, as if he understood that something important had just happened. Ethan stared at the envelope for a long time before touching it. His grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. The same thick letters he remembered from old birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen table when Ethan was a kid. To Ethan Walker. His fingers hesitated above the paper. Atlas nudged his knee gently. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "I know." He peeled the brittle tape away slowly. The envelope opened with a soft tear. Inside was a folded letter and several pieces of paper that looked older than anything Ethan had seen in years. He unfolded the letter first. The paper crackled as it opened. The handwriting inside was steady but aged. Ethan began to read. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you found the compartment. And if you found it, then you did exactly what I hoped you would do. You held on to something that everyone else thought was worthless." Ethan stopped reading for a moment. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "That sounds like you, Grandpa." Atlas tilted his head slightly. Ethan continued. "I knew someday life would get hard for you. Life always gets hard for the men in our family. But I wanted to leave you something more than money. I wanted to leave you a test. Anyone can spend money. Not everyone knows how to hold on to something when the world tells them it has no value. If you kept the dresser long enough to find this letter, it means you passed that test." Ethan swallowed. His throat felt tight. Atlas rested his head on Ethan's thigh, sensing the shift in emotion. Ethan looked down at the other papers that had fallen out of the envelope. They were thick documents printed on heavy stock paper. Stock certificates. Old ones. Very old. Some of the company names were familiar even now. Others he didn't recognize. He picked one up and read the date. Another one. Another. Ethan's eyebrows pulled together in confusion. "Grandpa, what did you do?" He moved to the laptop sitting on the small table near the window. The machine was slow and old, but it still connected to the internet when the weather was good. Tonight, the signal flickered weakly. He typed the first company name into the search bar. The page loaded slowly. Atlas sat beside him watching the screen, as if he understood every word. When the numbers appeared, Ethan leaned closer. He blinked, then blinked again. "That can't be right." He refreshed the page. The numbers stayed the same. The present-day value, represented by just that one certificate, had climbed into the millions. Ethan sat back in his chair. A strange, stunned laugh escaped his throat. "Okay, that's weird." He opened another certificate, another company, another search, another number. Higher, much higher. Ethan's breathing slowed. The cabin felt suddenly smaller. Atlas watched him closely now. Ethan leaned forward again and picked up the leather pouch. His hands were steady, but careful as he opened the small clasp. Inside were more documents. several more stock certificates, and one more folded sheet of paper. This one was shorter. Ethan unfolded it. The handwriting was the same. Ethan, the papers you found are only copies. The real assets are held in a trust. I didn't hide this money because I was afraid someone would steal it. I hid it because I wanted to make sure the right person found it. Someone patient. Someone loyal. Someone who understood the value of things that don't look valuable at first. The address you need is written below. Take this letter to the attorney listed there. He will explain the rest. And if Atlas is still with you when you find this, give that dog a good stick. He probably deserves it more than you do. Henry Walker. Ethan read the letter twice, then a third time. The words didn't feel real yet. A trust. An attorney. Real assets. Atlas lifted his head. Ethan looked down at him slowly. You hear that? Atlas's tail thumped once against the floor. Ethan shook his head in disbelief. Grandpa, you crazy old man. He leaned back in the chair and looked around the cabin. The cracked wooden walls, the sagging shelves, the old dresser that had just revealed its secret. Everything looked the same. But something inside Ethan had shifted. For the first time in years, the future felt like it might be bigger than the tiny cabin around him. Atlas stood and walked over to the dresser again. He sniffed the open drawer once more. Then he turned back toward Ethan. Ethan watched the dog quietly. You knew something was there, didn't you? Atlas didn't answer, but his eyes held the same steady look they always had. The look of a partner who had never once left Ethan's side. Outside the cabin, the snow continued to fall. Inside, Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Tomorrow, he would drive to the town listed in the letter, Bozeman. It was nearly 4 hours away, through mountain roads. He had no idea what waited for him there, but one thing was suddenly certain. The old dresser in the corner of the cabin had never been worthless, and the life Ethan Walker thought he understood was about to change completely. Ethan barely slept that night. The fire burned low in the iron stove, while the wind moved across the Bitterroot Mountains like a restless tide. Snow continued falling through the darkness, piling quietly around the cabin. Ethan lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same things again. The hidden drawer, the leather pouch, the letter in his grandfather's handwriting, and the words that kept circling through his mind. The real assets are held in a trust. Atlas lay on the floor beside the bed, his breathing slow and steady. The German shepherd had fallen asleep hours ago, but every so often his ears twitched at some distant sound outside. Ethan envied that calm. For him, the night felt endless. Around 4:00 the morning, he finally sat up. All right, he whispered into the quiet room. Enough. Atlas lifted his head immediately. Ethan swung his legs off the bed and pulled on his boots. We're going for a drive. Atlas stood up, tail swaying once. The sky was still dark when Ethan stepped outside. The cold air slapped him awake instantly. Snow had piled halfway up the truck tires during the night, and the windshield was buried under a thick layer of ice. It took nearly 20 minutes to clear enough to see the road. Atlas sat patiently in the passenger seat while Ethan scraped the glass. When the truck finally started, the engine coughed twice before settling into its familiar, rough idle. Ethan checked the envelope again. Inside were the copies of the certificates and the address, a law office in Bozeman, nearly 4 hours away through mountain passes. He stared at the paper for a moment. Guess we're going sightseeing. Atlas wagged his tail once. The drive east through Montana felt longer than usual. The road wound through frozen valleys and snow-covered forests, climbing slowly toward the mountains before dropping into wide-open plains. Sunrise came late behind thick gray clouds. By mid-morning, the sky had turned pale and bright, reflecting off miles of untouched snow. Ethan kept both hands tight on the steering wheel. The truck heater worked just well enough to keep the windows from frosting over again. Atlas sat upright beside him the entire time, watching, waiting. By the time the first buildings of Bozeman appeared on the horizon, Ethan felt like he had driven through an entirely different world. Compared to the quiet valley near his cabin, the town felt busy. Cars moved through intersections. People walked along sidewalks. Store signs glowed in the winter daylight. Ethan parked the truck near a tall brick building on Main Street. The law office address matched the letter exactly. Atlas hopped down beside him. Several people walking past paused when they saw the large German shepherd. But Atlas stayed close to Ethan's leg, calm and disciplined. Inside the building, the air smelled like polished wood and coffee. A receptionist sat behind a long desk near the entrance. She looked up when Ethan walked in. "Good morning." Her eyes dropped briefly to Atlas. "That's a beautiful dog." "Thank you," Ethan said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope. "I'm here to see a Mr. Harold Bennett." The receptionist nodded. "Do you have an appointment?" Ethan shook his head. "No, ma'am." He placed the letter carefully on the desk. "But I believe he might be expecting this." The woman picked up the paper and read the name on the front. Her expression changed almost immediately. She looked up again. "Please, have a seat." Ethan waited in the quiet lobby while Atlas settled beside his chair. 10 minutes passed. Then a tall man in a dark suit appeared in the hallway. His hair was gray and neatly combed, and he carried the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades handling serious matters. "Mr. Ethan Walker?" Ethan stood. "That's me." The man stepped forward and offered his hand. "Harold Bennett." His eyes moved briefly toward Atlas. "I see Henry's letter mentioned your partner." Ethan blinked. "You knew my grandfather?" "Very well." Bennett gestured toward the hallway. "Please, come with me." They entered a large office, lined with shelves full of old legal books. Bennett closed the door behind them and sat down at his desk. He opened the envelope Ethan had brought. His eyes scanned the documents carefully. Then he leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said quietly, "it seems Henry's plan worked." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "What plan?" Bennett folded his hands together. "Your grandfather established a trust nearly 30 years ago." Ethan sat down slowly. Atlas remained beside his chair, watching the room. "A trust?" Ethan asked. Bennett nodded. "He invested heavily in a number of technology companies during the 1990s. Ethan remembered the stock certificates, but those were just copies. "Correct." Bennett opened a folder on his desk and slid several documents across the table. "These are the originals." Ethan stared at the numbers printed across the pages. They didn't make sense at first. Too many zeros, too many commas. He looked up. "What exactly does this mean?" Bennett spoke calmly. "It means that the investments Henry made decades ago have grown significantly." Ethan's throat felt dry. "How significantly?" Bennett adjusted his glasses. Then he said the number. $250 million. The room went silent. Outside the office window, snow drifted slowly across the street. Ethan blinked. He looked back down at the papers, then back up at the attorney. "You're telling me," he stopped, trying to steady his voice, "that the old dresser, sitting in my cabin," Bennett nodded once, "to lead you here." Ethan leaned back in the chair. Atlas rested his head against Ethan's leg. The number echoed in his mind. $250 million. Ethan let out a long breath. "Grandpa, what did you do?" Bennett smiled faintly. Henry Walker was a patient man. He folded the papers neatly, and apparently he believed his grandson would be too. For the first time in years, Ethan Walker realized something. His life in that small cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains had never been as simple as it seemed. Because hidden inside an old piece of furniture was a fortune big enough to change everything. For several minutes, Ethan Walker didn't say anything. He sat in the leather chair across from Harold Bennett's desk, staring down at the documents spread in front of him. The numbers were still there. They hadn't changed. They looked just as impossible as they had the first time he read them. $250 million. Atlas shifted beside him, his warm weight pressing gently against Ethan's leg. The attorney cleared his throat, softly. I realize this may be a lot to take in. Ethan gave a quiet laugh that held no humor. That's one way to put it. He ran a hand across his face. I spent the last 3 winters trying to keep my truck running and my cabin heated. He tapped the paper lightly. And you're telling me my grandfather left me this? Bennett nodded calmly. Henry Walker believed strongly in patience. He folded his hands together. He also believed that wealth should go to someone who understood hardship first. Ethan stared at the window behind the attorney's desk. Snow drifted slowly past the glass. Bozeman looked peaceful, normal, as if the world outside hadn't just tilted sideways. What happens now? Ethan asked. Bennett opened a folder. The trust is already matured. Legally, it belongs to you the moment we complete the final verification. Verification? A simple process, Bennett said. Identity confirmation, signatures, and transfer authorization. Ethan exhaled slowly. How long? 48 hours. Ethan leaned back in the chair again. 48 hours. After years of struggling just to stay afloat, suddenly everything felt like it was moving too fast. Atlas lifted his head and looked up at him. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. You hear that? He murmured. Atlas's tail tapped softly against the floor. Bennett watched the moment quietly. Your grandfather mentioned the dog in the letter. Ethan nodded. He's the reason I'm still here. The attorney smiled faintly. Henry had a similar partner once, a shepherd during the war. Ethan looked up. I didn't know that. Most people didn't. Bennett slid the documents back into the folder. We'll begin the paperwork tomorrow morning. For now, I recommend getting some rest. Ethan stood slowly. The room suddenly felt smaller. Thank you, he said. Bennett walked him to the door. One more thing. Ethan paused. Henry asked me to pass along a message if you ever came through that door. Ethan turned. What message? Bennett's expression softened slightly. He said, if you found the compartment, then you were exactly the man he hoped you would become. For a moment, Ethan couldn't respond. Then, he nodded once. Outside the office building, the cold Montana air hit him again. Atlas stepped down onto the sidewalk and looked up at him. The streets of Bozeman were busy with late afternoon traffic. People moved between shops. Cars passed by. No one knew the man standing beside the old pickup had just discovered a fortune large enough to change his life forever. Ethan opened the truck door. Atlas jumped into the passenger seat. Ethan sat behind the wheel and looked at the envelope again. The original letter from his grandfather rested safely inside his jacket. For a long moment, he didn't start the engine. Instead, he stared across the street at the snow-covered rooftops. $250 million. The number didn't feel real yet. Finally, he turned the key. The truck rumbled to life. The drive back toward the Bitterroot Valley began as the sun dipped low behind the mountains. The road stretched for miles across the frozen land. Atlas sat quietly beside him, watching the horizon. By the time the truck reached the narrow road leading to Ethan's cabin, Darkness had already fallen. The snowstorm from the night before had cleared, leaving the sky bright with stars. The cabin appeared ahead, a small square of warm light in the middle of the dark forest. Ethan parked the truck and stepped out. The cold air was sharp, but calm now. Atlas jumped down beside him. They walked toward the cabin together. Inside, the old dresser still stood in the same corner, silent, unchanged. Ethan stared at it for a long time. $100. Rick Harlow's voice echoed in his memory. That wood would burn real nice. Ethan shook his head slowly. If you only knew. Atlas walked over to the dresser and sat beside it again, guarding it like he had from the very beginning. Ethan knelt beside him. You did good, partner. Atlas leaned into him gently. For the first time in years, the weight pressing on Ethan Walker's chest felt lighter. But he didn't realize something yet. News traveled fast in small Montana towns, and sooner or later, someone else was going to start asking questions about that old dresser. The night settled quietly over the Bitterroot Mountains. Ethan Walker sat at the small wooden table in his cabin, staring at the envelope again. The fire in the iron stove burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the wind had calmed, leaving the forest still and silent beneath a sky full of sharp winter stars. Atlas lay beside the dresser. The German shepherd had taken up his usual spot again, his body curled near the old wooden legs, as if the piece of furniture were something worth guarding. Ethan watched him for a long moment. You picked a strange treasure, buddy. Atlas lifted his head slightly, but didn't move. Ethan leaned back in the chair. The letter from his grandfather rested between his fingers. $250 million. The number still didn't feel real, but something else felt real. The quiet, the memories, and the long road that had brought him here. He rubbed his eyes. Sleep refused to come again. It hadn't come easily for years. The nightmares were never far away. Even now, sitting safely inside his cabin, Ethan sometimes heard echoes that weren't really there. The sharp crack of distant gunfire. The deep thud of explosions rolling across dusty valleys. The sudden shouting of men running through smoke. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. The memory came anyway. Afghanistan. 7 years earlier. The air had been thick with dust and heat that day. Ethan's patrol unit moved slowly along a narrow dirt road between crumbling stone buildings. Atlas had been younger then, faster, stronger. The dog moved ahead of the soldiers, nose low to the ground, searching for danger hidden beneath the sand. Ethan still remembered the moment Atlas froze. The dog had stopped in the middle of the road, completely still. Then Atlas turned and barked once. Sharp. Urgent. Ethan reacted instantly. Back. The team stepped away, just seconds before the explosion ripped the road apart. The blast knocked Ethan off his feet. Dust swallowed the sky. Ears ringing. Smoke. Everywhere. When he opened his eyes again, Atlas was dragging him across the dirt by the sleeve of his uniform. The dog's shoulder was bleeding. Shrapnel had caught him when the bomb went off. But Atlas didn't stop pulling until Ethan was clear of the blast zone. That was the day Ethan realized something. Atlas wasn't just a military dog. He was family. Back in the quiet cabin years later, Ethan opened his eyes again. Atlas was watching him. The dog always seemed to know when the memories returned. Ethan leaned forward and scratched behind the shepherd's ears. You saved my life that day. Atlas's tail tapped once against the floor. Ethan exhaled slowly. If it weren't for you, his voice trailed off. If Atlas hadn't been there, Ethan would have died in that desert road. The dresser would have been sold years ago. The hidden compartment would never have been discovered, and the fortune his grandfather had left behind would have remained buried forever. Ethan shook his head slightly. Funny how things work out. Atlas stood and walked over, resting his chin on Ethan's knee. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Outside the cabin, a distant truck engine echoed along the narrow mountain road. Ethan looked toward the window. Headlights passed slowly through the trees before disappearing again into the darkness. Probably someone heading back from town. Life in the Bitterroot Valley didn't change much from one winter to the next. But tomorrow, Ethan knew something would change. The trust paperwork, the signatures. The beginning of something entirely new. Yet strangely, none of that felt as important as the quiet moment he shared with the dog beside him. Ethan reached down and opened the leather pouch again. The copies of the old stock certificates still rested inside. He studied the faded company names once more. Some of them had become the largest technology companies in the world. His grandfather had seen something decades earlier that most people had missed. The same way Atlas had noticed the hidden compartment when Ethan couldn't. Ethan smiled faintly. Guess good instincts run in the family. Atlas tilted his head. The fire crackled softly behind them. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to imagine something different. Not a life filled with struggle and cold winters, but a life where he could finally breathe, where the weight of the past didn't feel quite so heavy. He looked down at Atlas. Again, you know what the first thing we're doing when this paperwork's finished? Atlas's ears lifted. You're getting the biggest stake Montana has ever seen. Atlas wagged his tail. But deep down, Ethan knew the money wouldn't change the most important thing in his life. The bond between a soldier and the dog, who never left him behind. Outside, the mountains stood quiet and dark, and somewhere out there in the valley below, word was already beginning to spread that something unusual had happened to the quiet veteran who lived alone in the cabin. Word that would soon reach the ears of a man named Rick Harlow. And when it did, the peace surrounding Ethan Walker's life was about to be tested. The next morning, in the Bitterroot Valley, began quietly. Thin sunlight slipped through the tall pines and touched the snow that covered the clearing around Ethan Walker's cabin. The storm had finally passed, leaving the mountains bright and cold beneath a wide blue sky. Inside the cabin, Ethan sat at the small wooden table with a cup of black coffee. Atlas lay beside the old dresser again. The German shepherd's ears twitched occasionally, listening to the forest outside. Ethan had learned long ago that Atlas heard things long before any human could. For a few minutes, everything felt peaceful. Ethan folded the letter from his grandfather and placed it carefully back inside the envelope. Today he would drive back to Bozeman and finish signing the final documents. 48 hours. That was all it would take for the trust to become real. Ethan took a slow sip of coffee. Big day, partner. Atlas lifted his head. His tail moved once against the wooden floor. Outside, a truck engine echoed faintly through the trees. Ethan glanced toward the window. The sound grew louder, closer. A few seconds later, a familiar pickup truck rolled into the clearing outside the cabin. Rick Harlow stepped out. Ethan frowned. That didn't take long. Atlas stood immediately. His body stiffened. Rick walked toward the cabin with the confident stride of a man who believed every piece of land in the valley belonged to him in one way or another. Ethan opened the door before Rick could knock. What brings you all the way out here? Rick removed his gloves slowly. Friendly visit. Ethan leaned against the doorframe. Didn't know we were that kind of friends. Rick chuckled. Well, word travels fast around here. His eyes drifted inside the cabin, straight toward the dresser. Ethan noticed. Rick nodded toward it. Still got that old thing, I see. Ethan crossed his arms. Sure do. Rick stepped inside without waiting for permission. Atlas moved closer instantly. The dog positioned himself between Rick and Ethan. Rick looked down at the German shepherd. Easy there. Atlas didn't move. Rick turned back to Ethan. I heard something interesting in town this morning. Ethan said nothing. Rick continued. Seems you drove all the way to Bozeman yesterday. Needed a change of scenery. Rick smiled. Funny thing about small towns. He walked slowly around the room, pretending to study the shelves and the old stove. People talk. He stopped beside the dresser. His hand brushed the surface of the wood. Someone said you visited a lawyer. Ethan's voice stayed calm. Is that a crime now? Rick shrugged. Nope. He tapped the dresser lightly. But it got me thinking. Tap. 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 This old thing must mean more to you than I thought. Atlas growled softly. Rick looked down at the dog again. Relax. He stepped back from the dresser. I came to make you a better offer. Ethan raised an eyebrow. For firewood? Rick reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded stack of bills. 5,000. The number hung in the air. Ethan almost laughed. Rick continued. For the dresser. Ethan shook his head slowly. Still not for sale. Rick studied him for a moment. Then he leaned closer. You sure about that? Atlas stepped forward. Slightly. Rick straightened again. Suit yourself. He shoved the money back into his coat. Just figured I'd ask before someone else does. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Rick smiled thinly. Nothing. He walked toward the door. But before leaving, he turned once more. You know how things are around here. His gaze drifted toward the dresser again. Sometimes old furniture ends up disappearing. Atlas's growl deepened. Rick raised both hands. Hey, I'm just saying. Then he stepped outside. The truck engine started again, a few moments later. The sound faded down the road. Inside the cabin, silence returned. Ethan closed the door slowly. Atlas remained standing near the dresser, still alert. Ethan walked over and rested a hand on the dog's back. You were ready for that one, huh? Atlas's ears stayed pointed toward the door. Ethan looked at the dresser, then back toward the road outside. Rick Harlow had never cared about that piece of furniture before. Not once in all the years Ethan had lived in the valley. Now suddenly, it was worth $5,000. Ethan exhaled quietly. That man smells money. Atlas nudged his hand. Ethan scratched the dog behind the ears. Well, he said softly, we've got one more trip to Bozeman today. Atlas's tail moved once, but neither of them realized something yet. Rick Harlow had not driven out to the cabin just to make an offer. And later that night, someone was going to come back to the cabin quietly, without knocking. The mountains were darker than usual that night. Clouds rolled slowly across the Bitterroot sky, hiding the moon, and leaving the forest wrapped in deep shadow. The only light around Ethan Walker's cabin came from the faint glow of the wood stove inside and the thin beam of a porch lamp above the door. Inside, the cabin was warm. Ethan had returned late from Bozeman that evening, after signing the final documents with Harold Bennett. The paperwork had taken hours, but by the time the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the process was complete. The trust was now officially his. $250 million. Even now, the number felt distant, almost unreal. Ethan sat near the stove, with Atlas lying beside his chair. The envelope containing his grandfather's letter rested on the small table next to him. Outside, the wind rustled through the tall pine trees. The forest sounded alive. Ethan stared at the fire. Grandpa really did it, he murmured quietly. Atlas lifted his head slightly. Ethan smiled faintly and scratched behind the dog's ears. You and me, buddy. Looks like we're not sleeping in a freezing cabin forever. Atlas's tail tapped softly against the floor. But something about the night felt different. The air carried a strange tension. Atlas sensed it first. The German shepherd suddenly stood. His ears lifted. His body turned slowly toward the cabin door. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" Atlas didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stood there listening. The dog's eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the door. Ethan reached over and shut the stove door quietly. The room dimmed slightly. The forest outside had gone very still. Too still. Then came the sound. A faint crunch. In the snow. Slow. Pound. Send. The room dimmed slightly. Careful. Someone was walking outside the cabin. Ethan's expression hardened. Atlas moved closer to the door, his muscles tense. Another step. Crunch. The sound came from the side of the cabin now. Whoever it was, they weren't walking toward the front door. They were moving along the wall. Ethan stood slowly. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Stay." Atlas froze in place. Another step outside. Then silence again. Ethan moved carefully toward the window and lifted the corner of the curtain, just enough to see outside. At first, he saw nothing. Then a shadow shifted near the truck. Someone was standing beside it. A tall figure. Heavy coat. Moving slowly toward the cabin window. Ethan lowered the curtain. His jaw tightened. "Rick." Atlas's low growl filled the room. The shadow moved closer. Outside the cabin wall, a hand brushed against the wood. Testing. Feeling. The person outside stepped toward the window. Atlas's growl deepened. Ethan whispered again. "Easy." The shadow paused, then moved again. Now the figure was beside the dresser wall, exactly where the hidden compartment inside the old furniture stood. Ethan realized something then. Rick wasn't guessing. He knew. The man outside suddenly tried the window latch. It didn't open. A second later came the quiet scrape of metal. A tool, trying to pry the frame. Atlas exploded into motion. The German shepherd lunged toward the door with a thunderous bark that shattered the silence of the mountains. Outside, the shadow jumped back instantly. The tool clattered against the wooden wall. Atlas barked again. Louder. More furious. Ethan threw the door open. Cold night air rushed inside. Rick Harlow stood frozen in the snow, about 10 feet from the cabin. A crowbar hung loosely in his hand. Atlas leaped forward. Rick stumbled backward, raising his arm instinctively. The dog stopped, just short of him, but continued barking. Teeth bared, body rigid like a coiled spring. Ethan stepped outside. The cold air bit into his lungs. "What the hell are you doing here?" Rick tried to recover his composure. "I was just breaking into my cabin?" Ethan cut in. Rick lowered the crowbar slowly. "You've got the wrong idea." Atlas barked again. Rick flinched. Ethan's voice hardened. "You came back after dark." Rick didn't answer. Snow drifted between them. The mountains were silent. Finally, Rick spoke again. "I heard about the lawyer." Ethan's eyes narrowed. Rick continued. "You really expect me to believe that old dresser's worthless?" Atlas stepped forward again. Rick backed away instinctively. "Call off the dog," he snapped. Ethan didn't move. Rick stared at the dresser, visible through the open door. Something greedy burned in his eyes. "Whatever you found in that thing," Rick said quietly, "it belongs to this valley." Ethan shook his head slowly. "No." Rick's voice dropped lower. "You don't understand the kind of problems money like that can bring. Atlas growled again. Rick glanced down at the dog. Then he stepped backward toward his truck. This is an overwalker. He climbed into the vehicle and slammed the door. The engine roared to life. Moments later, the headlights disappeared down the mountain road. Ethan stood in the cold for a long time. Atlas remained beside him, still watching the darkness. Finally, Ethan placed a hand on the dog's shoulder. You saved us another headache tonight. Atlas leaned into him. This time, Ethan did not dismiss the threat. He photographed the pry marks beneath the window, the boot prints in the snow, and the crowbar Rick had dropped beside the wall. Then he called the county sheriff. A deputy arrived before midnight, took Ethan's statement, collected the crowbar, and made it clear that Rick would be warned to stay off the property while the attempted break-in was investigated. Ethan had spent too many years surviving danger to pretend that greed would simply disappear on its own. Inside the cabin, the old dresser stood quietly in its corner. But now, Ethan understood something clearly. The secret hidden inside that furniture had changed everything. And from this moment forward, he and Atlas would have to protect more than just an old piece of wood. They would have to protect the life that secret had created. Morning came slowly to the Bitterroot Mountains. The night confrontation had left the air heavy with tension, but the valley itself looked as peaceful as ever. Sunlight spilled across the snow-covered hills, turning the entire landscape bright and quiet beneath the winter sky. Ethan Walker stood on the small porch outside his cabin. A steaming mug of coffee warmed his hands. Atlas sat beside him. The German shepherd watched the tree line the way he always did, alert, patient, and ready. Ethan took a slow sip of coffee. The events of the previous night still echoed in his mind. Rick Harlow standing in the snow, the crowbar, the greedy look in his eyes. Ethan exhaled quietly. That man's not finished. Atlas's ears twitched, but for now, the morning was calm. Inside the cabin, the old dresser stood exactly where it had always stood, its dark wood catching a thin line of sunlight from the window. For years, it had been nothing more than a forgotten piece of furniture. Now, it had become something else. A symbol. A turning point. Ethan stepped back inside. Atlas followed. The warmth of the stove filled the room again. Ethan walked to the dresser and rested his hand against the smooth wooden surface. You caused quite a mess, didn't you? Atlas sat beside it again, guarding it just like the first day Ethan brought it to the cabin. Ethan smiled faintly. You were right to trust this thing, but deep down he knew something important. The dresser itself had never been the real treasure. It had only been the test. 2 days later, after the sheriff's office confirmed that Rick had been served with a formal trespass notice and was under investigation for the attempted break-in, Ethan drove back to Bozeman once more. The final transfer from the trust was complete. For the first time in his life, Ethan Walker had more money than he could ever spend. Yet when he drove back toward the Bitterroot Valley that afternoon, he didn't feel like a rich man. He felt like the same quiet veteran who had lived in a small cabin with his dog, and that was exactly the man he intended to remain. The first thing Ethan did with the money surprised almost everyone in town. Instead of leaving Montana or buying a mansion somewhere far away, he purchased a piece of land just outside the valley, the same land where his grandfather's old farmhouse once stood decades earlier. The building was long gone, but the mountains were still there. The wind still moved through the same fields, and the land still felt like home. Over the next year, something new slowly appeared on that land. Not a mansion, not a luxury ranch, but a simple place built for a different purpose. A quiet center, designed to help military veterans struggling with the same battles Ethan knew too well. Men and women carrying the invisible weight of war, the kind of weight that followed them home long after the fighting ended. Ethan funded the entire place himself. Therapy programs, outdoor training, working dogs, counseling services, a safe place where veterans could breathe again. And at the center of it all was Atlas. The German Shepherd became something of a legend among the veterans who visited the property. Some called him a hero. Others simply called him the best therapist on 4 legs in the state of Montana. Atlas accepted the attention with calm dignity. But every evening, when the visitors had gone and the sun dipped behind the mountains, he returned to the one place he had always belonged. Ethan sighed. 1 year later, on a quiet winter afternoon, Ethan stood inside his new home, overlooking the valley. The house was simple. Strong wood beams, wide windows facing the mountains, and inside the living room, the old dresser stood proudly against the wall. The scratches in the wood were still there. The faded carvings still showed the same delicate patterns of vines and flowers. Atlas lay beside it, exactly the way he had in the cabin. Ethan walked over and ran his hand across the dresser's surface. "So, this was your plan, Grandpa." Atlas lifted his head. Ethan looked down at the dog. "You found the secret first." Atlas wagged his tail slowly. Ethan smiled. The truth had become clear to him over the past year. The dresser had never been about money. The fortune had simply been the tool. The real gift had been something else entirely. Patience, loyalty, and the understanding that sometimes the things people laugh at are the very things that change your life. Ethan glanced out the window. Across the valley, a group of veterans walked along a snowy trail, with several trained dogs moving beside them. For the first time in years, the valley echoed with something stronger than silence. Hope. Ethan looked back at Atlas. "Good work, partner." Atlas stood and walked over, resting his head against Ethan's hand. Outside, the Bitterroot Mountains stood tall beneath the winter sky, and inside the house, the old dresser remained exactly where it belonged. Not because it held a hidden fortune, but because it reminded Ethan Walker of something far more valuable. The day a loyal dog refused to give up on a piece of forgotten furniture, and in doing so, helped a broken soldier find his way home again. If this story touched your heart, I'd like to ask you something simple. Type 1 in the comments if you believe a loyal dog can change a person's life. Or type 0 if you think people sometimes underestimate the power of loyalty. I read as many comments as I can, and I truly love to see where you stand. And if you enjoy stories like this, stories about courage, loyalty, and the quiet strength between a soldier and his dog, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even more powerful than this one. And who knows, the next loyal dog we talk about might remind you of one you've known yourself.